welcome to the Debrief. Happy New Year. I'm Donna King. I'm editor-in-chief of Carolina Journal. We've got everything you need to know, everything that's been going on over the last few weeks. We're running into 2025 with lots of new changes, lots of interesting policy focuses. So stick with us. We're going to be covering a lot in this episode of the Debrief. Joining us from the Locke Foundation, Mitch Kokai, of course, with all his great insight, Donald Bryson, our fearless leader here, and Jim Sterling and all his election expertise. Okay, let's jump right in. First of all, Governor Josh Stein sworn in on New Year's Day and hitting the ground running, already headed up to Asheville to make some big announcements. So, Donald, actually, I'm going to lead with you. What do you think we can expect from a Stein administration heading into 2025?
Oh, I think we're going to see a continuation of a lot of what we saw from the Cooper administration.
Sure.
I think my personal opinion is that on a personal level, Josh Stein is probably to the left of Roy Cooper.
Okay.
I think he legislated that way. Roy Cooper was much more of a moderate pro-business Democrat when he was in the legislature, and then has tacked much more to the left as he became governor. I think we'll see a lot of similar stuff from Josh Stein. He kept a lot of the same people. Heck, he had the same campaign consultant.
Right.
And so I think we can see, unfortunately, from a John Locke perspective, more of the same.
Okay, all right. So one of the things I noticed going straight into this first day or two of the Stein administration, they've already got like kind of high-produced video out. I mean, I'm interested in that because we're going to be covering everything he does. So I like the idea that he's trying to be more accessible, perhaps. But policy-wise, what do you think?
I think Donald's right that it's going to be, in many ways, a continuation of the Cooper administration. One of the things that was interesting from a person who had worked in a previous Democratic administration and is still somewhat involved in state government. I had heard a couple of weeks ago that this person was consulted by the Stein people saying, well, what would you do? You know, what would you recommend? And he said, clean house, just get everyone out, not necessarily because there's anything wrong. This is a person who'd be left of center, so would not have a problem, particularly with Roy Cooper's priorities and policies, but just so that Josh Stein could rebrand the governor's office with himself and have his own people and start afresh.
Right.
And apparently the Stein people said, oh yes, this sounds like a good idea. And then they had Cooper people as part of their administration turnover team. You know, so basically a lot of it is going to be the same thing that Roy Cooper focused on. I think the style will be interesting to see, whether it's the same type of style. And also, does Josh Stein follow Roy Cooper's lead in trying to be so antagonistic with Republican legislators, or does he say, you know, that really, over the past 8 years, hasn't worked as well for us as we had liked. Why don't I try to work with them on the issues that we can work together, come up with a good arrangement there, and then on the issues that are very polarizing and partisan, we'll fight on those, but we'll try to minimize that.
All right, a little more honey and vinegar.
I'm sorry, that antagonistic sort of mindset that Cooper had with the General Assembly, it worked for a while and was very popular in the left wing of the Democratic Party for Cooper. But what the Republicans went 29 for 29 in veto overrides in the past legislative session. I mean, at some point, maybe we don't keep running up the same hill.
Right. What are your thoughts?
Well, he's already got a little bit of an issue on that. We've seen already with the recent hurricane relief bill with Davis getting a little bit of heat from the Democratic side.
Sure.
If they try to pressure out a lot of the members to always vote in block line or in straight line with the Democratic Party, some of those people may buck back. We saw Tricia Cotham change parties. I don't know if we're going to see somebody else do that same thing this year now.
Right.
It's hard to remember this 2025, but that's also a possibility, and there's also a possibility that people from the Democratic side vote with Republicans on certain issues.
Sure.
We'll see that, but for Stein, I think a lot of his early administration's going to be about the hurricane. It's got to be.
He's in Asheville here on his first full day in office, already expecting, making some first executive orders. I mean, first day in office headed out west. So I think we are going to see a lot of that.
Well, it's not just going to be about this hurricane, but also the recovery efforts from the prior ones that Cooper's administration, frankly, botched.
Right.
We're still seeing a lot of people in those hotels, after all, from storms in 16 and 18.
Sure. Actually, I'm going to jump into this real quick. Over this past week, we heard from, you remember Renee Olmos and I went out with the North Carolina National Guard, got in a Chinook helicopter, amazing experience, but saw some of that devastation. firsthand. We met some great families out in Yancey County while we were out there. And these families really were kind of left on their own during that time because Milton came in right after it and they just were not getting the help they needed. They were stuck in this valley of where their community was in Little Creek, just near Burnsville. The families there, 14 of them got together and did what they could to repair the road in and out in October, and said, they got their own, dump trailers and their trucks and their personal tractors, and they got away in and out. So they were able to at least get the old people out, get their community some access. They said that the DOT, they called me and said, we're trapped again. Because there was a ton of rain Saturday and Sunday of this past week out west, and they said, we're already trapped because DOT contractors had blocked off the road that they fixed and put a temporary low water bridge. Well, that low water bridge became compromised in this weekend's rains. So they were stuck again. And I mean, I have so many pictures. I talked to a few of them that were just like, what do we do? We are so frustrated. And they said that this is happening all over the area. Just that slow government wheel is turning in a way that is just not efficient. Now, to their credit, I called DOT, immediately called me back. Their media said, hey, look, I don't know exactly what's happening, but I'm going to find out. And so they were able to get back in touch with me and said, all right, we've got contractors out there the next morning. They're working on getting that low water bridge. They don't want to fix the bridge that the community built, the one that stayed. But they're trying to fix that low water bridge. This process has got to be painful for folks out west.
It is. It's got to be painful, and it's something that people in Florida have dealt with for a long time.
Sure.
Joseph Harris, who's the fiscal policy analyst for the John Locke Foundation, has been writing more and more about how North Carolina has handled emergency recovery, and has covered very well how NCOR has failed. I mean, for the past 8 years, they just have. Nobody denies that. And so what he's done is taken a good look, and will continue to work on this in the next coming months, at what Florida has done in ways in which, in terms of disaster recovery and emergency management, they've been able to privatize some of that. And I know a conservative libertarian organization is looking at privatizing some government service, right? But they're getting more responsiveness in Florida. And if one state has dealt with emergency management more than Florida, I don't know what it is.
There are best practices out there.
And they recover so much faster than most other states. And so that's something that I know that there's a large appetite for in the State House with Destin Hall's new leadership coming into the General Assembly on how can we refine this emergency management process and get it done faster for people like in Avery County and Yancey County.
Yeah, of course. You mentioned regulatory environment.
I could see that being the first avenue that they look towards, because a lot of places, one of the big issues that they ran into was some of these houses or some of these homes that they built that were to help people out in the West after the storm, they couldn't utilize because...
I'm hearing that too, like these tiny houses and sheds and things that people are trying to just put a roof over their head.
So my understanding was it was certain issues with building codes.
Okay.
And some of that
in
got...
Buncombe County specifically.
Buncombe County, okay.
Yeah.
Some of that got relieved in the hurricane relief bill that was part of the business building codes. I believe got changed on that, but there's not all of that that's handled just yet. So this could be, we could see some...
People are still living in their cars,
Cars, I've heard tents, I've heard a bunch of different stuff, but I could definitely see a regulatory relief being something that they focus on, especially in the short term, and then building out from there.
That makes sense.
And going back to what we were talking about earlier, it'll be interesting to see whether Josh Stein will go along with something like that. If it seems like a common sense change, and it's not just, Republicans trying to cut out government, but something that will actually help people, that could be seen as common sense by people across the aisle, does Josh Stein put on his hat of trying to govern and say, yes, this is something that we do, or does he put on his Democrat partisan hat and say, no, this is, regulators should regulate and they should be the ones in charge? Your story, I think one of the things about it to me that really strikes me is this is a case where government gets in the way. I mean, you can understand why DOT only wants to fix its bridge, because they know it meets the standards and they aren't going to get sued. And and if you
that's
allow,
kind of what it seemed like. They were like, well, I don't know, it may not be safe.
And if you allow this other bridge that worked to operate, well, maybe someone will get hurt and they'll sue the DOT because they allowed this to happen. When in fact what's happening is you're blocking these people from being able to get to the outside community because of this bureaucratic process that is not helping anyone.
Right. It's crazy. So let's jump ahead, if we could, a little bit on that Griffin-Riggs race. Believe it or not, it seems like November isn't even over yet. Tell me what's going on. What's the latest over the holidays?
Yeah, so we're talking about the one outstanding major state election in North Carolina, the race for a seat on the state Supreme Court.
Okay.
Allison Riggs, the appointed Democrat, looks to be the winner over Republican Jefferson Griffin from the State Court of Appeals by just 734 votes out of 5.5 million cast. But Griffin is continuing a legal challenge because he says more than 60,000 ballots that were cast in that election should not have been counted because of some various problems, the largest of which being that these people who registered to vote never provided the driver's license number or the last 4 digits of the Social Security number. So this is a case that's moving on. He filed a complaint with the state Supreme Court in the week before Christmas. The day after he filed that complaint, the State Board of Elections moved it to federal court. So it's sitting in federal court before Chief District Judge Richard Myers. Myers set a deadline of New Year's Day for the State Board of Elections, for Allison Riggs, for some other groups, activists who are working with Mark Elias, to file all their paperwork saying why they should not go along with what Griffin wants and why the case should stay with him and not go back to the state court. We saw enter into this case names from yesteryear, Tom Daschle and Richard Gephardt, former Democratic congressional leaders. In fact, the first time I saw it, I thought, are these guys still alive? Yes, I guess they are. And they're filing paperwork on the North Carolina Supreme Court race. And so right now sits in Chief Judge Myers' court. Griffin will have a chance to file one more bit of paperwork Friday, and then presumably Myers will make a decision relatively soon, because as things stand now, this election will be certified on January 10th unless there's some sort of court order blocking it. Once the election's certified, Griffin's pretty much done.
Sure. Cooper, has Cooper gotten engaged with this particular race? It seems like, Allison Riggs, he appointed her twice, right?
So he did appoint her twice on that. I don't know if I've heard anything directly from him, but the Democratic Party has been very vocal on this as a whole. They've kind of been the leading voice of it. They've had protests. They've had various press conferences calling for him to just concede the race. But he still has that open avenue through the court systems to challenge some of these protests. And a lot of these protests that went before the State Board of Elections are somewhat viewed in a partisan light. All of the votes, except for one on the protest, was a split along party lines, 3-2. The only one that was unanimous was on his challenge for, I believe it was the no ID for overseas voters. That was because they looked at it and said, hey, we set the rules on this for voter ID on overseas. We can't just change that afterwards. But all of the other ones were not even heard, and it was on that 3-2 ruling. Even the local protests. This challenge is only on the federal or the statewide protests, not the local ones that were challenged as well. So they, I believe, dismissed all of those cases on Friday. So, or last Friday, I should say.
This isn't going to shift the balance of power, a partisan makeup of the court. Why do you think there's been so much attention on it?
Well, one, we have a very recent history in the past 8-10 years in North Carolina of having very, very close judicial races. I think Chief Justice Newby won by, 400 votes just a few years ago.
I think so.
This is separated by 700 votes, and it's very contentious. If Republicans won this race, if Jefferson Griffin won this race for Republicans and ousted Allison Riggs out of that seat, then Republicans would have secured a majority on the state court through 2030 at the very least. And so that's why it's very important. Now, to your point, it does not currently change the makeup of the court. But it does make the next races in 2026 and 2028 much, much more important for Republicans, and this would have given them a lot more cushion and grace over the next few years.
And we know the Democrats really focused on this as sort of the, let's make this the place where we make our stand, elect Riggs, re-elect Anita Earls if she runs for re-election the next time around, and then we could start attacking the Republicans, because that's when their seats start coming.
So what's next? We have certification unless something happens.
Unless there's a court ruling, there'll be the certification, which would be a week from Friday, and then basically Griffin's options are over, and you would have the current membership of the court would remain in 2025, because Riggs is the incumbent in that race, and then people will start looking ahead to 2026, when right now The only seat up for grabs is Anita Earl's seat. And I say right now because now that Donald Trump is back in office and he has a Republican Senate, there's a very strong chance that at least one, maybe more, of our Republican state Supreme Court justices could be considered for the federal bench. If they are, then that means there would be other seats up for election in 2026, and they would be ones now held by Republicans.
And the replacement between now and then would be appointed by Josh Stein.
Aha!
Although,
all comes together.
Although, remember, part of Senate Bill 382, which is, I'm sure this is going to be challenged too in court, but it isn't yet. And Senate Bill 382 says if there's a vacancy in the Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court, that the governor has to appoint someone of the party that was elected to that position, which is different than the way it's been. The way it has been, and what Governor Cooper has done several times, is a Republican wins, moves from one court to the other, he appoints a Democrat to replace him.
Which is how we ended up with Chief Justice Beasley.
That's right. That's how we had Chief Justice Beasley.
Martin left to go to whatever college he went to, Regent University.
It's how twice we ended up with Allison Riggs. I mean, before she was elected, well, she seems to have been elected this time, she was appointed to the Court of Appeals by Cooper, appointed to the state Supreme Court by Cooper. And he had no restrictions, but part of Senate Bill 382, which was passed December, over the governor's veto, and this part has not been challenged yet in court, although I assume that it will at some point, is that if there's a vacancy on one of these statewide judicial races, the governor still makes an appointment, but it has to be someone from the party that the voters elected, which from a policy perspective, since we are voting for judges and we are voting for them with a party label, it only makes sense that you would have you would follow the will of the voters and have someone of that same party until they have another chance to vote on a full election.
Well, now speaking of policy, switching to the legislature, tell me about the focus for the John Locke Foundation. We've talked a lot about legislative reform, school choice. What do you think some of those priorities should be this year?
Well, we've talked about one of them already. I think we're going to have to reform how we do emergency management here in this state. We figured out there are gaps, massive gaps dating back 8 years. And like I said earlier, I know that Destin Hall, the presumptive incoming Speaker of the House, has mentioned at several events around the state that he is interested in reforming how we handle that.
That's encouraging.
So that's something that we're already working on. In terms of what our priorities are going forward, we'd like to do some things to secure the future funding for the Opportunity Scholarship Program, and of course universalizing the Opportunity Scholarship and universalizing school choice through that has led us to another conversation about let's reform how we do public school finance. It's overly complicated. School systems have a hard time dealing with it. It's archaic. It's from another time. And so let's find out ways to simplify this formula. We've produced a paper on this just last year, and actually groups from the left have reached out to us saying, hey, we're interested in what you're talking about. This could help local school systems in a lot of ways. And it's just smart governance stuff. We also have a thing called the franchise tax here in North Carolina. It's a tax that all businesses of all sizes pay, whether they've made a profit or not. It's basically a tax on the investment, on the size of the business itself. And so everything from Bank of America in Charlotte down to Bill's Plumbing, who has trucks and a warehouse and pipes and things like that, they have to pay taxes on all of these things. And so when we're trying to,
it's just an entry fee into running a business.
And so when we have hundreds and tens of millions of dollars going to companies through things like JDIG and the One North Carolina Fund, it's silly that we then have this other tax that actually taxes a physical investment in the state. Let's not do that anymore to incentivize more business and actually get more jobs in this state. So those are just some of the things. We also have things in agriculture and energy reform that we'd like to get into, but those are sort of the big ticket items for us this year.
Well, actually, a lot of folks may be spending this kind of holiday break working on their taxes, I would imagine, and some good news coming.
Some good news. Your state income tax rates are going down in North Carolina from 4.5% to 4.25%.
That's good news.
And if we continue to hit revenue triggers, and everything in the past indicates that we will, it'll go down to 3.99% next year, just so we can say we're below 4%.
That's exciting.
And so that's great. And of course, the corporate income tax rate is also stepping down as well, which means that companies will have more of their own cash that they can reinvest in workers and reinvestment in their own company.
Explain the revenue triggers for me.
Well,
Yeah, please.
I'll let Donald do that if you'd like, but one of the nice things about this is these are things that are already spelled out in law.
Right.
So whatever
Right.
Josh Stein wants to do on taxes,
right.
he can't block these things from happening because they've already been passed.
Sure.
But real quickly on revenue triggers, the
Yeah.
idea is you will have a rate cut that will take effect, but it only takes effect if you hit a certain revenue target. And the idea was, we saw when North Carolina started this whole realm of moving into tax
Right.
reform that they didn't want to be Kansas.
Sure.
Because what Kansas did was they cut the rates in a major way, but then didn't cut spending
Right.
and didn't adjust spending to adjust to the new lower rates. And so they ended up with huge shortfalls, and it was a major failure.
Okay.
North Carolina has had success for more than a decade by saying we're going to cut rates, but we're also going to keep a lid on spending growth.
Right.
And so the revenue trigger just takes that an even further step, saying the rate's going to go down, but it's only going to go down if we meet this revenue target that we think we need to meet to run state government.
Right.
If we don't meet the target, the rate stays the same. If we do meet the target, the rate goes down. It's a good governance issue, and it's one that, and Donald can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think other states have looked at North Carolina and said, hey, this is a good idea. We should do it too.
They have. A lot of other states have looked at it, and a lot of other states are still talking about doing it.
Sure.
And mostly because we've never had a year where we didn't meet the revenue triggers. We have hit them every time,
Amazing
and
growth,
we've
yeah.
always gone down.
Sure.
We've had great growth, but it also eats into the narrative that we hear from the left and the press, and I've repeated myself,
Sure.
that this is just willy-nilly conservatives going cutting taxes just for the sake of cutting taxes, and it's all tax. No, this is a responsible way to go step by step of giving people back their own paycheck.
Right. Right. All right. That is good news as we wrap up the year. Anything else you're going to be focused on in 2025?
Lawsuits.
I mean,
and
tons
we
of
should
them.
expect them.
All right, lawfare. All right, we look forward to hearing more about that. Thanks so much for joining us on The Debrief. You can find us here every week on Thursday evenings. And then, of course, check out carolinajournal.com for the latest news and analysis on all of the stories that we've covered here and on johnlocke.org. Thanks so much.